So thank you for coming, everybody. We will be talking about semiconductor supply for Europe this afternoon. We are Andreas Kornet, 30 years of experience with McKinsey & Company.
And Markus Bollig, 25 years with BMW and since May last year with VDA. Why don't you give it a start, Markus?
Sure. Ladies and gentlemen, we expect the global supply for semiconductors to rise across all industries. This doesn't come as a surprise, but maybe more remarkable, we expect the automotive demand to increase 1.7 times faster than the overall market until 2030. And let's look into more detail into the data. Here you see the worldwide market for semiconductor and the distribution between the different industries. And automotive is expected to increase by a factor of 3 until 2030, from $50 billion in 2021 up to $150 billion in 2030. We're with this increase by a factor of 3, the fastest growing industry overall. And if you compare the factor of 3 to the growth rate of the overall market, 1.8, then you see the difference, the 1.7 I mentioned before. Also, we are becoming the third largest customer in semiconductors in 2030. And we will have to increase our market share from 8% to 14% in the market. Considering the shortage we had in the last years, this may become a significant challenge for us. What are the reasons for the strong increase of demand for automotive? It is not the expected increase in volume for new vehicles. It is clearly technology-driven. And what we call ACES, those technologies are the driver for this strong increase. And so it's basically the increase in demand for every single vehicle that is responsible for this rise. And looking at ACES, ACES stands for A, autonomous or automated or assisted driving. Within this scope, the demand will rise by a factor of 5.1. For connectivity and shared, this includes also body functions and infotainment, displays in the car. This scope will rise by a factor of 1.9. And especially the transition from combustion engines to pure electric drives in the powertrain, this will account for another factor of 4.4. So this overall brings the increase of factor 3. Here it is important that the first 2 points, autonomous driving and connectivity, will be mainly driven by competition. So we need to introduce these functions in the vehicle to stay on the level of the rest of the competition, while the transition to electric drives is mainly driven or also driven by legislation. So by 2030, we'll have roughly 65% of the portfolio purely electric. This is clearly mandatory by the limits we have in 2030. I have one example to illustrate where the demand comes from. Here you see the comparison for the complete powertrain. On the left-hand side, as a component, the inverter. In an electric vehicle, the inverter is the component sitting between the battery and the e-motor. It's controlling speed and power of the e-motor. And if you see in the upper picture, the PCB assembly with a huge number of chips, and in the lower picture you see 24 silicon carbide MOSFETs, basically the power transistors of the system. Compare the two columns. For the combustion engine drivetrain, we basically need two electronic control units, one for the engine and one for the automatic gearbox. Compare this to the pure electric drivetrain for inverter, for cell module controller, DC-DC converter, onboard charger, battery management system, and junction box. Yeah, you need in total a number of semiconductors that is 10 times higher compared to the combustion engine. And as I said, this transition will be mandatory. There's no way this is not going to happen. If we're talking about supporting production of semiconductors in Europe, it is very important to understand what are the technologies that are needed in automotive. And looking at the first category, Auto-Messe, you see that the distribution between different node sizes is almost evenly distributed. The upper one is the so-called leading edge scope, 14 nanometers or less. The second, 22 to 65 nanometers, the so-called state-of-the-art technologies. And the lower, 90 nanometers and greater, is the so-called legacy nodes. Looking at connectivity, we already recognize that most of the demand is located at the legacy nodes and even more enhanced for the electric drives. 80% of the demand comes from the legacy nodes, 90 nanometers or larger. So keep this in mind for the later discussion on production sites to be established in Europe. Looking at current investments worldwide in the required nodes, we see that unfortunately, although the automotive industry has most of the demand in legacy nodes, 19 nanometers and greater, investment today goes mainly in the other node sizes. And especially in China, there is clearly some investment in the large node sizes. But looking at Europe and the US, in a do-nothing scenario, the supply in Europe will rather decrease the self-supply than increase. And this basically brings us to the necessity and to the proposal to strongly invest also in these technologies in Europe. And with this, I would hand over to you, Andreas. Let us know in more detail what the proposal could be.
Thanks a lot, Markus. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, if we want to take a European industry perspective now, and building on what Markus has said, three things are very important. First of all, you saw that particularly in automotive, which is very interesting to us, of course, here, but also in industry electronics, the demand for semiconductors is growing above average. Second, you will all know that if you look at European industry, exactly these two industries, like automotive industry and the overall industry, you know, needing industrial electronics, are particularly strong. And to be precise, some 80% of the European demand for semicon is going into these industries. So it's particularly important to secure the supply of semiconductors for these industries. And last but not least, the third element is that particularly these two industries, as Markus has explained, need semicon node sizes, which are to a large extent 19 nanometer and above. So if we want to look at Europe and ask the question, how can we achieve to some extent self-sufficiency, how can we become resilient? It will be extremely important to look at the entire manufacturing value chain of semicon, which you see on this chart. So it will be a necessity to be sufficient in each of the steps, to secure availability in each of the steps. Talking about, at the very beginning, the workforce, and just giving you an example, if we talk about Magdeburg Intel, they announced that in the end state, it will be more than 10,000 people. That's quite large. It will be about energy. Again, taking the Magdeburg example, there is calculations saying that the electricity consumption of this plant will be higher than the electricity consumption of the city of Magdeburg. So we need to talk about energy. Of course, we have to talk about equipment and materials like lithography machines, silicon. Yeah, like, for instance, ASML is an important, very important market leader, European player. We are talking about wafer manufacturing. We are talking about the front end, which is basically where we have the lithography and also the etching and basically the wafer is being processed. And last but not least, we talk about the back end, where we have like the packaging and the testing. It's very important to have access to be resilient in the entire value chain. But for making it a bit easier, I want to focus now on front-end fabs, because they require the highest capital amount. They are like very, very asset intensive. And if we take a look at the front-end factories, we think it's important to look at two dimensions. And I mentioned it already, like mature modes are particularly important for Europe. So on the x-axis, the question would be, are we having enough manufacturing capacity for those mature nodes to make sure that those European industries, for instance, automotive, are getting enough semicon supply of those semicons they need. But we think it's also important to think about the other axis, the y-axis, which is more about like capability, yeah, to be in those leading edge technologies. Because, they might be not so important for European industries today because we don't have a lot of computer manufacturers or cell phone manufacturers or that. Nevertheless, I think we all agree that there's no technology Europe should be stepping out of if it has a global importance. So we think it will be very important to look at those two dimensions and to basically move in this upper right corner, the orange corner, if you talk about self-sufficiency. So that's one idea how to think about it. So what have we done together? On the left-hand side, this gray bar, you basically see what will be the European demand, and we looked at basically companies having a production in Europe, so industrial companies, but also automotive companies. So we are not only looking at automotive, we are looking at the entire European segment. And the demand in 2030, looking from now, will be 22.4 million wafers per year. Oh, that's million wafers per year as a unit we are looking at. On the very right-hand side, you see the other gray bar saying what's the current capacity, and if we calculate in productivity gains until 2030. And you can easily see that in the middle, there's a gap. And the gap is pretty large. It's 12.7 million wafers per year. And of course, if we want to talk about self-sufficiency in Europe, we have to talk about those 12.7 million wafers. And again, you see the distribution among the node sizes, and you see 90 nanometers and above is the largest one with 7.2, and then you have 22 to 65 and above and below 14 nanometers. So again, like you see that the majority is on those mature nodes. That's actually what we need most in Europe. We went further, and for the calculation we have been doing, and I'll show you the result in a second, we looked at 3 different segments, taking into account the global supply chain for semicon. And we said there will be one segment, that's very left, number 1, where we have a severe global shortage. So regardless where you are on this planet, outside Europe, inside Europe, Asia, US, there is a shortage for those components. There will be a shortage for those components. That's, for instance, is silicon carbide technology, which we need, of course, in the electric cars. And there, of course, it makes just sense to invest in Europe because, those capacity is not only needed in Europe, but also everywhere in the world. Then we have the middle segment, number 2, where globally we only have a minor shortage, but we have a huge shortage from a European perspective. So we are not self-sufficient. So again, here you should invest selectively because you don't want to create massive overcapacities, but you want to become less dependent. And the right-hand side is even more extreme, where we have a global surplus, which means we have enough capacity on this planet, but there could be dependencies Europe is having, which from a geopolitical point of view, you don't want to have. So these were basically 3 different logics for building semicon capacity and for investing in this area. So what was the outcome of this exercise? And you see this on this chart. Again, you see the numbers you have seen before, 12.7 on the left-hand side. And basically in this modeling, we said to have 100% self-sufficiency is an unrealistic target, and it will be very expensive. So we said, why don't we go for a reduction of 80% of the dependency we are having today? So from 12.7 to 2.6, you see it on the right-hand side. And then the question is, what would be the fabs, the front-end fabs we need? And you see it quite clear, like in the cluster number 1, if you add it up, it's 31 fabs. Yeah? And again, 23 of them, the majority, in those mature modes I have been mentioning. Then in the middle, like minor global shortage, you see 2, which are in this segment 22 to 65. And on the very right, it's altogether 4. You can see the segments. Altogether, that would basically mean that to go a giant step, let me put it that way, into self-sufficiency in Europe from an industry perspective, not only automotive, industry perspective, we would need 37 additional fabs, front-end fabs, only looking at the front-end fabs right now. And that would be like order of magnitude, a capital requirement of more than $200 billion US. You might say, that's unrealistic, 200 billion. Nevertheless, keep in mind, these are I would say, the majority factories which will be built somewhere on this planet anyway. The question is where? And I think the target would be, from a European perspective, of course, and from supply chain resilience, to get them being built in Europe and to get this investment in Europe. That's the idea. So it's not about like finding 200 billion. It's about like making sure some of that gets invested in Europe, from a European perspective, of course. So you might say, well, 37, good luck, Andreas, good luck, Markus, that's a very high number. Nevertheless, if we look at what happened in the last 2 years in Europe, it's not too bad. You see 11 factories there, which are either being built or have been announced and so on. You see again Magdeburg, but you also see others. You see that the amount of investment is very different, from below 1 billion to more than 25 billion and so on. So if we build on that, I think 2 things will be important. First of all, let's get more of that. So what do we have to do with the European Chips Act? What do we have to do with admission times it takes to get an admission to build something, and so on and so on. But again, also, we will have to look at the other parts of the manufacturing value chain, which I did not talk about so far. So that's basically where we are. Like 37 would be needed. 11 are already announced. So the remainder is 26 until 2030. Let me conclude with maybe sharing one idea which is very important if we look at this semicon self-sufficiency, but we think it could also be applied to charging infrastructure or to renewable energies or to any other of these areas where we have to accelerate. And we think it's all about acceleration, it's all about speed. And we think to get this speed, it really needs new approaches. It needs new ways of cooperating. And that's why we, created the idea of the acceleration formula, which tries to bring together 3 things. First of all, what we need is a roadmap. And I think it is very, very important that the VDA put together this roadmap for the semicon fab landscape. It's very important. How much do you need? What kind of fabs do you need? What kind of technology do you need? So this is existing. So this is good, and it could be deepened. The second thing would be catalysts. Yeah? Like, for instance, the European Chip Act, which currently has an order of magnitude of 43 billion euro. You know, it's a bit more complex than that, but you know, for the sake of easiness, let's say it's 43 billion. Maybe we need more. Maybe we need to be faster. Maybe we need to be faster in all kinds of admissions. Maybe we need to get faster in, in all kinds of allowance, which is required to build something like that. So that's the second element. And the third element is a platform for cooperation. So it's very important that different parts of the industry and regulators come together. So semicon manufacturers, automotive companies, industrial companies, Brussels, so the European Union, the different states, because only in working together in a closer way, they will be able to get this acceleration and to make sure this is all happening, to create some extent of self-sufficiency for semiconductors in Europe. And you know, if we talk about the aspiration and in terms of acceleration, it's quite massive, because if you want to have these factories running until 2030, you have to figure in that it takes at least 3 years, maybe even longer, to build them. So if you do the math, basically you will arrive at having a new factory being announced every 2 to 3 months from now until whatever, 26 and beyond. Thanks a lot for listening. Very much appreciate. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.